Your father is dead, and so is your place in this family. She was declared homeless at her own father's grave. The rain hadn't stopped when the last handful of dirt was thrown onto William Harrison's coffin. Funeral flowers lay crushed beneath expensive shoes. Mourners were already drifting away, their black umbrellas disappearing one by one through the iron gates of Woodlawn Cemetery. And right there, between the fresh grave and the fading crowd, Scarlett Harrison was told that her life no longer mattered. Your father is dead, a cold female voice said from behind, and so is your place in this family. Scarlett turned, her knees still sinking into the mud, just in time to see the security guard stepping forward. Her small bag was ripped from her hands. The world spun. Her fingers clutched the only thing she had left, a thin necklace her father once told her never to lose. Thunder cracked. The gates slammed shut, and Scarlett was dragged away before she ever knew what her father had truly left behind for her. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you believe powerful stories deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Scarlett stood outside the wrought iron gate of Woodlawn Cemetery, while the rain still poured without mercy. Her black funeral dress had long since been soaked through, plastered to her skin like a cold, clinging shell. She watched the line of glossy black cars pull away one by one, their taillights fading into the curtain of rain, carrying off the people who had called themselves her father's friends, his partners, his family. Not one of them looked back. Not one of them stopped to ask whether she needed help. To them, Scarlett Harrison had ceased to exist the moment William Harrison's heart stopped beating. She remained there, trembling, and the memory of her father surged over her like waves that couldn't be held back. William Harrison hadn't been born into wealth. He'd started as an ordinary real estate broker in Brooklyn, working 18 hours a day, sleeping in his office, eating cold bread to get through meals. But he had what others didn't: vision, and a stubborn persistence that bordered on iron. He saw possibility in abandoned lots, in leaning buildings other people wanted to tear down. One deal at a time, $1 at a time, he built the Harrison Real Estate Group with his bare hands into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Yet success didn't bring complete happiness. Scarlett's mother died when Scarlett was only 12, a sudden heart attack in the middle of the night, with no chance to say goodbye. Scarlett still remembered the way her father sat beside the hospital bed, gripping her mother's hand after it had gone cold. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He only stared into empty space, as if his soul had left with her. After that, the mansion on the Upper East Side became too silent, too vast for two people. Her father tried to be both father and mother, but there was more and more work, longer and longer business trips, and the distance between them kept widening, even though neither of them wanted it to. Then Victoria appeared 5 years ago. She seemed like the perfect solution: beautiful, elegant, able to speak the language of the upper crust, able to make William laugh again. Scarlett wanted to hate her, but she couldn't find a reason. Victoria was always polite, always proper, always saying the right things in front of others. Only behind closed doors did the look she gave Scarlett turn cold as ice. Derek, Victoria's son from a previous relationship, moved in right after the wedding. He was 25, arrogant, and he looked at the house as if it already belonged to him. From then on, everything changed so slowly, Scarlett almost didn't notice. Her room was moved from the second floor to the third. There was no longer a place for her at family dinners. Photographs of her gradually vanished from the living room. And her father either didn't see it or didn't want to see it. In the final months, William grew seriously ill. He often sat alone in his study, calling his lawyer Harold Whitmore at strange hours, and looking at Scarlett with an expression she couldn't understand. Once he took her hand and said, "You're stronger than you think." But when she asked what he meant, he only shook his head and told her to go rest. Now she understood. He'd been saying goodbye. The wail of a police siren yanked Scarlett back to the present. A patrol car pulled up at the curb, red and blue lights sweeping across her face. An officer rolled down the window and looked her up and down with suspicion. "Miss, you can't stand here. This is private property." Scarlett wanted to scream that her father was inside that cemetery, that she had more right to be there than anyone, but she had nothing left to prove it. No papers, no phone, no money. She was only a drenched girl standing in the rain, and in this world that meant she was nobody. She turned and walked away, each step heavy on the slick sidewalk. The lights of Manhattan blinked in the distance like false promises. She didn't know where she would go, where she would sleep tonight, how she would keep living. For the first time in 27 years, Scarlett Harrison was nobody at all. Scarlett found an ATM on the corner of 52nd Street, its green light blinking like a sliver of hope in the stormy night. She still remembered the PIN. She still remembered the savings account her father had opened for her when she was little. She still remembered the balance. At the very least, it should have been tens of thousands of dollars. But when she fed the card into the machine, the screen flashed a cold message. "Card has been locked. Please contact the bank." She tried again and again. The result didn't change. Victoria had moved faster than Scarlett ever imagined. In only a few hours after the funeral, everything that belonged to Scarlett had been severed as if she'd never existed. She went to a public payphone, dropped the last coin she could find in her coat pocket into the slot, and began to call. Jessica, her best friend from college, the one who'd sworn she'd always be there for her, didn't pick up. Scarlett called back 3 times. Each time it went straight to voicemail. Michael, the ex-boyfriend she once thought she'd marry, his number had been changed. Other friends, the ones who'd laughed with her at parties in the Harrison mansion, the ones who'd said they adored her, not one of them answered. Maybe Victoria had reached them too. Maybe they'd heard she'd been cast out of the family and decided a Scarlett without money wasn't worth their time. She went to a small hotel near Times Square, soaked and pathetic. The front desk clerk looked her up and down with a suspicious stare. When she said she needed a room but didn't have a credit card or identification, the man didn't even bother to reply. He only shook his head and pointed toward the door. She tried 2 more hotels. The outcome was the same. The night grew late. The rain kept falling. Scarlett had nowhere left to go. She made her way to Penn Station, where there was at least a roof overhead and benches to sit on. She curled up on a bench in a shadowed corner, trying to make herself as small and invisible as she could. But around 2 a.m, a group of 3 drunk men spotted her. They came closer, their breath reeking of alcohol, their hands reaching for her. One of them grabbed her wrist and laughed, ugly and leering. Scarlett yanked herself free, kicked his foot, and ran. She ran like she'd never run before. Through empty corridors, up staircases, out onto the street. She ran until her lungs felt ready to burst, and her legs couldn't take another step. She found a dark alley behind a closed restaurant, huddled between trash bins, and waited for dawn. The days that followed passed like a nightmare with no ending. Scarlett tried to find work, any work at all, but everywhere turned her away. No address, no identification, no phone number to reach her. She couldn't even get a job washing dishes at a small diner because they needed a copy of an ID she didn't have. Hunger began to claw at her stomach on the second day. She searched for food in dumpsters behind restaurants, swallowing her tears as she ate leftover pieces of bread she would have never glanced at only days before. The cold of New York nights sank into her bones, making her shake without stopping, no matter how tightly she curled herself up. On the 3rd day, a homeless woman about 50 sat down beside her on a park bench. She had tangled silver hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering. Without a word, she handed Scarlett half a loaf of bread. Scarlett wanted to refuse, but hunger was stronger than pride. When she finished eating, the woman finally spoke. "The first night is always the hardest. Then it gets easier. Or you get used to it." Scarlett didn't know which sentence was more terrifying. On the 4th day, she stood in front of a pawn shop, staring down at the necklace in her hand. The pendant glittered under the light, probably worth a few $100s. Enough for a warm hotel room, a hot meal, one night without fear. Her fingers tightened around the chain and her feet carried her toward the door. But then she stopped. Her father had told her never to lose it. It was one of the last things he'd ever said to her. And even though she didn't understand why, she couldn't betray his words. She turned away and walked on, the necklace still resting beneath her wet clothing. On the 5th day, Scarlett barely had the strength to stand. Her head spun from hunger, her legs trembled with exhaustion, and her vision began to blur. She didn't know how far she'd gone or where she was, only that she was on some small street in Queens, standing in front of a bakery with a faint, sweet warmth drifting out through the door. The smell of fresh bread, the smell of butter, the smell of sugar. She drew in one deep breath, and the world collapsed. Scarlett fell onto the sidewalk, right in front of the glass door of that tiny bakery. When Scarlett opened her eyes, the first thing she felt was warmth. Not the skin-slicing cold of the street, not the rigid concrete of back alleys, but real warmth from an old wool blanket that was worn yet clean. She was lying on a narrow couch in a small room crowded with sacks of flour and sugar, gentle yellow light spilling down from a ceiling lamp. Somewhere nearby, there was the faint scent of toasted bread. An Asian woman of about 55 sat across from her, holding a bowl of steaming hot porridge. She had black hair threaded with gray, neatly pinned into a bun at the nape of her neck, a face lined with wrinkles, but eyes that were bright and kind. She didn't ask who Scarlett was, where she'd come from, or why she'd collapsed in front of the shop. She only held the bowl out toward Scarlett and said in English, her voice carrying a slight Chinese lilt, "Eat, then we'll talk." Scarlett wanted to refuse, wanted to ask who the woman was, wanted to explain, but hunger was stronger than everything. She took the bowl with trembling hands and began to eat. The heat slid down into her empty stomach, and warmth spread through her body. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten something hot like this. When the bowl was clean, the woman stood up. "I'm Margaret Chen, but you can call me Maggie. This is my bakery. You can sleep in the storage room tonight. Tomorrow morning we'll talk." Then she turned off the light and closed the door, leaving Scarlett alone in the warm darkness. That night, for the first time in 5 days, Scarlett slept a real sleep. The next morning, Scarlett woke when the first sunlight slipped through a small window. She found Maggie kneading dough in the kitchen, her hands moving with the practiced certainty of someone who'd done this work for decades. Scarlett stood in the doorway, not knowing what to say. Finally, she spoke. "I can work for you. Anything. I don't need money. I just need a place to stay and food." Maggie didn't turn around. She kept kneading. "Can you wash dishes? Can you mop floors? Can you wake up at 4 in the morning?" Scarlett nodded, even though Maggie couldn't see her. "I'll learn." Maggie stopped, then turned to study her with a measuring gaze. "I don't need to know your story. I only need someone who shows up on time and works hard. Can you do that?" "I can." "Then start by washing that pile of dishes in the sink." 2 weeks passed, and Scarlett slowly found a new rhythm inside Maggie's tiny bakery. She woke at 4 in the morning, helped Maggie prepare the dough, and shape the loaves. She washed dishes, mopped floors, arranged pastries on the shelves, served the customers who came in for their morning bread. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done, but Scarlett didn't complain. She kept her identity hidden, told no one that she'd once been the daughter of a billionaire, that she'd once lived in a mansion on the Upper East Side, that she'd once had a private driver and a credit card with no limit. To the bakery's customers, she was only a young girl hired to work, nothing more and nothing less. Maggie was a sharp observer. She didn't ask, but she saw everything. She saw the awkward way Scarlett held a knife, like someone who'd never had to cook for herself. She saw how Scarlett kept her back straight even while mopping, the posture of someone raised under strict instruction from childhood. She saw the look in Scarlett's eyes when she stared out the window, the look of someone running from something. One evening, after the bakery had closed and the two of them were cleaning up, Maggie spoke without warning. "You're not like the others who've asked for work here. Your hands are soft like you've never had to do heavy labor, but your eyes are hard like you've seen too much." Scarlett paused with the cloth in her hand. "Does that bother you?" Maggie shook her head. "No, everyone has a past. I'm not hiring your past. I'm hiring your present." Scarlett smiled for the first time in weeks. A small smile, but real. But that moment of peace didn't last long. That night, when Scarlett was getting ready to lock the back door, the front door was kicked open. 4 men walked in, faces flat and cold, arms covered in tattoos. The one in front swept the bakery with a contemptuous glance and snarled, "Time to pay for protection, old woman." Maggie stood behind the cash register, her face gone pale, her hands trembling. But before she could say a word, Scarlett stepped forward, placing herself between Maggie and the group of thugs. The man leading the thugs looked at Scarlett the way an elephant might look at an ant bold enough to block its path. He stood nearly 1.9 meters tall, broad-shouldered, his neck covered in tattoos of a snake coiling around his throat. He barked a laugh, rough and rasping, and it filled the tiny bakery. He said to his boys that this little girl wanted to play the hero. Scarlett didn't step back. She stood there with her spine straight, her gaze locked on the man in front of her, even though her heart was pounding as if it wanted to break through her ribs. She told him to leave the woman alone, that she didn't owe them anything. He tilted his head, entertained. Then without warning he swung his arm and shoved Scarlett aside, the way someone brushes away an object in the way. She hit the floor hard, her shoulder slamming into a table leg, her mouth catching the edge of a chair and splitting open, blood running down to her chin. One of the others began to smash everything. He knocked over the bread rack, and the loaves that Maggie and Scarlett had risen at 4 in the morning to make tumbled onto the floor, and were crushed beneath filthy shoes. The glass of the display case shattered, fragments spraying everywhere. Maggie cried, the choked sobs of a woman who'd worked her whole life to build this small bakery with her own hands. Scarlett pushed herself up, blood still streaming from her lip. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She only stood there and looked straight into the eyes of the man who'd struck her, her stare cold as ice. For a second he seemed to falter under that look, but then he stepped forward, grabbed Scarlett by the collar, and lifted her. He demanded to know what she was staring at. Scarlett still didn't speak, didn't plead, only watched him with eyes that didn't tremble even as his grip squeezed her throat. At that moment, headlights cut through the bakery window. A sleek black car stopped right out front, the kind Scarlett knew cost at least $500,000. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was about 1.85 meters tall, black hair swept back, his face sharp-edged like it had been carved from stone. A perfect black suit fit his powerful frame without a single wrinkle, as if he'd stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. But what caught Scarlett wasn't his appearance, it was his eyes. Cold gray eyes, knife-sharp, swept across the wrecked shop and settled on the thugs. There was no emotion in those eyes, only pure danger. The leader released Scarlett at once, his face, so arrogant a moment ago, turning pale as if he'd seen a ghost. He stammered the name, Mr. Blackwood. The man didn't look at him. He only stood there with both hands in his pockets, his voice low and cold as a winter night. He told them they were on his territory, and to get out, right now. 4 words. Just 4 words. No shouting, no threat. Yet the thugs who'd been so vicious a moment earlier suddenly scrambled like rats cornered by a cat. They shoved past one another toward the door, not one of them daring to look back, and vanished into the night within seconds. The bakery fell into a silence so tight it was suffocating. The man walked in, polished black leather shoes stepping over shattered glass without a flicker of concern. His gaze passed over Maggie trembling behind the register, over the ruined racks, then stopped on Scarlett. She was leaning against the wall, one hand clutching her aching shoulder, blood still running from her lip to her chin. But she didn't lower her head. She met his eyes directly, without fear, without gratitude, without anything at all. He tipped his head, a flicker of amusement sliding through those cold eyes. He asked who she was. Scarlett answered calmly that she was nobody. He gave a thin smile, a smile with no warmth, and said that nobody doesn't stand up against 4 men. Scarlett didn't respond. She'd learned in her days on the street that silence can be the best weapon. The man drew a black business card from his inner pocket and held it out to her. Sebastian Blackwood. He told her that if she needed real work, she should call. Scarlett took the card and looked down at it. There was only a name and a phone number. No title, no address, nothing else. She looked up at him, then slowly tore the card in half right in front of his face. She thanked him, but said she didn't need it. Maggie sucked in a sharp breath. Another man came in through the back door, big and solid, clearly a bodyguard, and he stared at Scarlett with open disbelief, as if she'd just done the most insane thing in the world. But Sebastian Blackwood didn't get angry. He only watched Scarlett for a long moment, his gray eyes brightening with something hard to read. He said she was interesting. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The bodyguard followed, but before he went out he stopped and asked Sebastian who she was. Sebastian didn't turn back. He said she was either very brave or very stupid, and told him to find out which. The black car glided into the night, leaving Scarlett and Maggie standing amid the ruins. Maggie looked at Scarlett with wide eyes and asked if she knew what she'd just done, because that man was Sebastian Blackwood, and no one in this area dared to oppose him. Scarlett didn't answer. She bent down and picked up the 2 torn pieces of the business card from the floor. Her fingers found the piece with the phone number, and she quietly slipped it into her coat pocket. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because she'd learned that on the street, sometimes the most dangerous enemy can also become the most useful ally. 2 days after that night, Scarlett was jolted awake by the smell of smoke. She'd been sleeping in the storage room behind the bakery when the sharp, scorched stench punched into her nose, tangled with the hiss of fire and the crash of breaking glass. She sprang up, survival instinct honed by those days on the streets pushing her into motion before she could even think. The flames had already swallowed the front of the shop, orange-red tongues licking up wooden shelves and flour sacks, spreading with unnatural speed, as if someone had poured gasoline everywhere. Scarlett charged toward Maggie's tiny upstairs bedroom, thick black smoke turning every breath into a fight. Maggie was still there, still asleep, unaware of the hell blooming beneath her. Scarlett shook her awake, hauled her out of bed, and carried her down the back stairs. A falling piece of burning wood struck Maggie's arm and she screamed in pain. But Scarlett didn't stop. She kept dragging her, through the back door, out into the alley behind the shop. They collapsed onto the cold ground at the exact moment the roof gave way, the fire surging upward like a monster that had just swallowed its prey. The fire trucks came, but it was too late. The little bakery Maggie had built over 20 years was nothing but ash, Maggie was taken to the hospital with a second-degree burn on her arm and mild smoke inhalation. The doctor said she'd be fine, but she needed to stay in the hospital for at least a week. Scarlett sat in the hallway, her back against a cold wall, staring into the empty space in front of her. She'd lost everything again. For the second time in less than a month, she was back to zero. No money, no place to live, no one to lean on. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket without thinking, and her fingers touched a crumpled scrap of paper, the torn piece of the business card she'd kept. She sat there for a full hour, staring at the phone number printed on it. She knew what calling that number would mean. She knew who Sebastian Blackwood was, or at least she could guess. Those brutal thugs had feared him like they feared death. This whole area sat under his control. He wasn't a good man. But right now, Scarlett didn't need a good man. She needed to survive. She found a public payphone in the hospital and dialed. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Sebastian's low, cold voice came through. He said he'd been wondering how long it would take. Scarlett swallowed the anger rising in her chest. She said she needed a job, a real job. Silence for a second. Then Sebastian told her to come to Brooklyn, and that they would talk. An address was read out. Then the line went dead. No concern, no explanation, no acknowledgement. Only an order. Scarlett went to that address the next morning. It was an old building tucked deep in Brooklyn's industrial district, the outside peeling and covered in graffiti like so many other abandoned buildings in the area. But the moment she stepped through the heavy iron door, the world inside was entirely different. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, leather and oak furnishings. This was the lair of an underground empire, and Sebastian Blackwood was waiting for her on a black leather chair in the middle of a vast sitting room. He watched her enter, cold gray eyes sweeping from head to toe. He said the fire hadn't been his doing, but he knew who had done it. Scarlett stood before him and didn't sit down, even though there was an empty chair right beside her. She asked who. He told her it was the same group that had come to the bakery that night, that they belonged to a gang trying to expand its territory into this side, and that they thought burning the shop would send him a message. Sebastian rose, walked to the window, and looked out. He said she wanted a job, and that he had work for her. He said he needed someone to keep the books for one of his restaurants, legal, at least on paper. He said she looked like someone intelligent. Scarlett didn't ask why he believed she could do it. She only asked what he wanted in return. Sebastian turned back, a smile as thin as a razor appearing on his mouth. He said she worked for him. She got a place to live, a salary, and protection, and she didn't ask unnecessary questions. Scarlett looked at him for a long time. She didn't trust him. She had no reason to trust him, but she also had no other choice. She said she agreed. Sebastian nodded, as if her answer had been inevitable. He said Marcus would take her to where she'd be staying, that she would start work tomorrow, and that she could go. Scarlett turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Sebastian's voice came from behind her. He told her she'd stepped into his world now, Scarlett, and she shouldn't expect to step out easily. She didn't turn back. She didn't answer. She just kept walking, but the words echoed in her head all day long. She'd stepped into darkness, and she didn't know how deep it went. A month passed faster than Scarlett expected. The job at Sebastian's restaurant turned out to be far less simple than she'd assumed. It was an upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, elegant and legitimate on the surface, but the books were tangled beyond belief. The previous manager had been careless, or had been hiding something on purpose, and Scarlett spent her entire first week just trying to understand the system. But she'd been trained well. The years at Wharton Business School, the evenings spent listening to her father explain how an empire actually runs, none of it had been wasted. She began to see the errors other people missed. An unusual expense here, a number that didn't line up there, phantom invoices from vendors that didn't exist. She built a new spreadsheet, rebuilt the entire bookkeeping structure, and within 3 weeks she'd saved the restaurant nearly 20% in operating costs, simply by cutting out waste and small frauds. Sebastian didn't say anything, but she knew he was watching. Now and then she caught those cold gray eyes on her from a distance when he stopped by the restaurant. He didn't praise her. He didn't criticize her. He only watched, like a cat weighing its prey. It made her uneasy, but she didn't dwell on it. She had other things to worry about. That night, Scarlett couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room Sebastian had arranged for her above the restaurant, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. Thoughts of her father, of Victoria, of her old life, kept spiraling through her mind like waves that wouldn't stop breaking. Her hand drifted to her chest without thinking, to the place where the necklace still rested beneath her clothes. She'd kept it since the night of the funeral, but she hadn't truly looked at it since she'd been driven away from the cemetery. She sat up, switched on the light, and took the necklace off. Under the yellow glow, she studied it closely for the first time. An oval pendant, made of silver, nothing special at first glance. But when she held it, it felt heavier than it should. Thicker, too. She turned it over, and found a faint groove running around the edge, as if the pendant could be opened. Her heart began to hammer. She found a small knife in the drawer and carefully worked the blade into the groove. A soft click sounded, and the pendant split into two halves. Inside, nestled in a hidden compartment, was a tiny USB drive, no bigger than the tip of her pinky finger. Scarlett stared at it, her hands shaking. Her father had hidden this inside the necklace he'd told her never to lose. He'd known something was going to happen, and he'd prepared. She wanted to run straight to a computer and open it, but she didn't have a personal laptop, and she didn't want to use any device that belonged to Sebastian. Not because she trusted him less than others, but because she didn't trust anyone. This secret was hers, and she would keep it until she understood everything. Early the next morning, before the sky had fully brightened, Scarlett slipped out of the restaurant and took the subway to the New York Public Library in Manhattan. She was the first person waiting when the doors opened at 8 in the morning. She went to the public computer area, chose a hidden corner, and plugged the USB drive in. 4 files appeared on the screen. The first was titled The Official Will of William Harrison. She opened it, and her heart seemed to stop. It was her father's real will, signed and notarized, stating clearly that Scarlett Harrison would inherit 70% of the assets of Harrison Real Estate Group. Victoria would receive 20%, and Derek would receive nothing at all beyond a small cash payout. The second file was a copy of the will Victoria had submitted to the court, and Scarlett recognized at once that it was a forgery. Her father's signature had been faked, not perfectly, but well enough to fool anyone who didn't know. In that version, Victoria inherited everything, and Scarlett wasn't mentioned. The third file contained hundreds of pages of documents detailing illegal transfers of money from Harrison Group into Victoria's and Derek's personal accounts, beginning 3 years earlier, totaling tens of millions of dollars. Her father had known. He'd gathered evidence, but for some reason, he hadn't acted. The fourth file was a video. The file name made Scarlett's breath catch in her throat. For Scarlett, after Dad is gone, she stared at it, the mouse cursor hovering over the play button. Her heart slammed wildly inside her chest, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control the mouse. Her father had left her a message from the far side of death, and she was about to hear his voice one last time. Scarlett put on the headphones, drew in a deep breath, and pressed play. The screen went black for a second, and then her father's face appeared. Her heart clenched as if a hand had closed around it. William Harrison looked into the camera with exhausted eyes. His face was far thinner than she remembered, cheeks hollowed, skin pallid, like a man who hadn't slept for nights on end. He sat in his familiar study, the desk lamp throwing light across the lines on his forehead that she'd never noticed before. He looked like a man who already knew he was dying. "Scarlett, my daughter." His voice filled her ears, low, warm, and so familiar it hurt. "If you're watching this video, it means I'm gone, and Victoria has shown you her true face." He paused, as if searching for the right way to arrange what he needed to say. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry. I failed to protect you while I was alive, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to understand why things happened the way they did." William looked straight into the camera, as if he were looking straight into Scarlett's eyes. "I discovered Victoria married me for money in the 2nd year of our marriage. I caught her copying company documents, listening in on my business calls, and passing information to Derek so he could get close to key partners. But by then it was too late. She had too many secrets from Harrison Group, information that could destroy the company if it leaked to our competitors." He exhaled, the weariness plain on his face. "I couldn't divorce her. If I did, Victoria would drag me into court. She'd make public everything she knew. She'd destroy everything I built for 30 years. And more than that, she threatened to hurt you. I couldn't take that risk." Tears began to slide down Scarlett's cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, and she didn't look away from the screen. "I was weak. I chose a false peace instead of facing the truth. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough, that I let you endure coldness and isolation in your own home while I did nothing. I failed you as a father." William lifted a hand to rub his eyes, and Scarlett saw his fingers were trembling too. "But I prepared everything to protect you after I'm gone. The real will is on the USB you're looking at. You are the legal heir to 70% of Harrison Group. The documents here prove the will Victoria will submit is forged, and that she's embezzled tens of millions of dollars from the company. This is everything you need to reclaim what's yours. He leaned closer to the camera, his voice turning more serious. There is only one person you can trust, Harold Whitmore, my personal attorney for 20 years. He knows about the real will, and he'll help you. But you must be careful. Victoria has connections in the police department and in politics. Don't go to the police, at least not until you have undeniable proof and someone powerful behind you. William fell silent for a long moment, his eyes softening into the tenderness Scarlett remembered from childhood, when he'd held her in his arms and told her fairy tales each night. I couldn't protect you while I lived, but I made sure you will be protected after I'm gone. Everything you need is inside that necklace. He smiled, a sad smile full of love. Scarlett, my little girl, you're stronger than you think, stronger than I ever was. Don't let anger swallow you. Don't become someone like Victoria. Be stronger than me. Live true to who you are. And remember that your worth isn't in how much you inherit, it's in who you are. His eyes were red, his voice tightening. I love you, Scarlett, always. The video ended. The screen returned to black, but Scarlett remained motionless, the headphones still on her head, her eyes fixed on nothing. Tears ran down her cheeks, down her chin, splattering onto the keyboard. But she didn't make a sound. She cried in silence, the way she'd learned to cry during lonely nights in the Harrison mansion when she was little, when she missed her mother so much she could barely bear it, but she didn't want anyone to hear. She sat there for hours, replaying the video again and again, listening to her father's voice again and again, trying to memorize every expression, every gesture, every word. This was all she had left of him. The last minutes preserved before death stole him away. When the late afternoon sunlight began to spill through the library windows, Scarlett finally took the headphones off. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, pulled out the USB drive, and tucked it carefully into her inner pocket. She stood up, spine straight, eyes forward. She wasn't the fragile girl who'd been driven from the cemetery in the rain anymore. She wasn't the homeless woman wandering New York streets. She was Scarlett Harrison, the legal heir to Harrison Real Estate Group, and she would take back everything that belonged to her. I'm coming for it all, Victoria, but I'll do it my way, not yours. Harold Whitmore's law office was on the 12th floor of a sleek, high-end building in Midtown Manhattan. Scarlett stood at the reception desk in the simple work clothes Sebastian had provided, looking like any ordinary office employee passing through New York streets. She'd woken early that morning with one clear resolve in her mind: find Harold Whitmore, the only person her father said she could trust. The receptionist behind the counter studied her with suspicion, eyes moving from head to toe as if deciding whether Scarlett belonged in this office at all. Who are you here to see? Scarlett swallowed and forced her voice to stay steady. I need to see Mr. Harold Whitmore. It's personal. The receptionist offered a polite but distant smile. Mr. Whitmore doesn't see anyone without an appointment. You can leave your name and phone number, and we'll contact you later. It was the familiar answer Scarlett had heard too many times in the past weeks. She knew if she left her name and number, she'd never get a call back. She needed to be more forceful. She drew in a deep breath and spoke loudly enough for anyone in the office to hear. Tell him William Harrison's daughter is alive and wants to see him. The receptionist went pale. Other staff looked up, staring at Scarlett with shock and disbelief. A heavy silence settled over the room for a few seconds. Then a door at the far end of the hallway flew open, and a man in his 60s stepped out. Hair white, face lined, but eyes still sharp. He saw Scarlett and froze as if he'd seen a ghost. His complexion drained until he looked almost bloodless. Scarlett? His voice trembled. But they told me you were dead. Scarlett walked toward him, her heart racing. As you can see, I'm still alive. Harold Whitmore stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to prove to himself this wasn't an illusion. Then he turned to the receptionist, his voice snapping into something cold and commanding. Cancel everything on my schedule today. I don't want to be disturbed. He led Scarlett into his private office, shut the door, and locked it. The room was spacious, with glass walls looking out over the Manhattan skyline, but Scarlett had no mind for the view. She sat in the chair opposite Harold's desk. He sat across from her, his hands clasped together, trembling. They said you killed yourself, Harold began, his voice still shaken. 2 weeks after William's funeral, Victoria held a press conference. She cried in front of the cameras and said, "You were overcome with grief over your father's death and ended your own life." There was a death certificate, a police report, everything. The media ran with it for a few days, and then people moved on. You, Scarlett Harrison, were accepted by society as dead. Scarlett felt the blood in her body turn to ice. She knew Victoria was cruel, but she hadn't imagined she could go that far. Victoria hadn't only driven her out of the house, she'd erased her existence. Harold continued, bitterness seeping into his tone. I tried to investigate. I tried to contact the police and ask about the circumstances of your death, but everything was sealed. Victoria has people in the police department, in politics. She staged it so perfectly no one questioned it. And I was fired only a week after that, threatened that if I dared speak up, I'd lose my license, lose everything. Scarlett pulled the USB drive from her pocket and set it on the desk. My father left this for me. Harold stared at it, then plugged it into his computer. He read through the documents, watched the video, and when he finished, his eyes were wet. This is the real will, he said, his voice thick. William showed it to me before he died. I knew it existed, but I didn't know where he hid it. And the will Victoria submitted, it's already been validated by the court. Harold shook his head, pained. She moved too fast. Within a week after the funeral, she filed the forged will. The court accepted it, and now she controls 100% of Harrison Group. Can we overturn it? We can. Harold nodded. But it won't be easy. We need more evidence. We need to prove her will is a forgery. We need an excellent legal team. And most of all, you need protection. Victoria won't sit still once she learns you're alive. She tried to erase you once. She'll do it again. Scarlett stayed silent. She knew Harold was right. She needed someone powerful at her back. Someone Victoria wouldn't dare touch. Harold looked at her, as if weighing something. You're working for Sebastian Blackwood, aren't you? Scarlett flinched. You know, I have my own eyes and ears, Harold sighed. He might be the only one powerful enough to stand against Victoria. Scarlett shook her head. He's a criminal. Harold met her gaze with the look of a man who'd seen too much of the world's dark truth. And Victoria is one too. She's just better at hiding it. At least Sebastian Blackwood is honest about what he is. That night, Scarlett returned to Sebastian's headquarters in Brooklyn, with a decision she'd weighed carefully, one she could feel down in her bones. She found him in the office, on the top floor, seated behind a massive oak desk, the desk lamp carving sharp bands of light and shadow across his angular face. Marcus was standing guard by the door, but when Scarlett appeared, Sebastian signaled for him to leave. The door shut, and the two of them faced each other in a silence that felt heavy enough to touch. Scarlett took the chair opposite him, drew in a slow breath, and began to tell him. She told him everything. Who she really was. Her father, Victoria, the night of the funeral, when she'd been thrown out of her own home. She told him about the days on the street, about the necklace and the USB hidden inside it, about the real will and the forged one, about meeting Harold Whitmore, and about the horrifying truth that she'd been declared dead. She held nothing back, not a single detail, not a single corner softened. This was the biggest gamble of her life, placing everything on a man she hardly knew, except for one thing. He was the most dangerous man in this part of the city. Sebastian sat motionless from beginning to end. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. Not a flicker of emotion crossed that stone-cold face. His sharp gray eyes stayed on her, unwavering, as if he were reading every line written in her soul. When Scarlett finished, the room fell into a silence so long it became suffocating. Then Sebastian spoke, his voice low and even. I know who you are. I've known for weeks. Scarlett froze. You knew? Then why didn't you say anything? Sebastian leaned forward, fingers laced on the desktop. Because I wanted to see what you'd do. Whether you'd run or whether you'd fight. Whether you'd keep hiding forever or stand up and take back what belongs to you. He paused, then continued. You chose to fight. That makes you useful. Scarlett didn't know whether to feel angry or relieved. She'd lived with the fear that Sebastian would use this against her. But it turned out he'd known from the start, and hadn't moved on it. Why? She asked. Why help me? You've got no reason to. Sebastian rose and walked to the window, looking out over Brooklyn's lights. Victoria Monroe cheated my organization out of $20 million in a real estate deal 3 years ago. She promised. She signed. Then she vanished with our money. It was the biggest loss I've ever taken. And I don't forget people who steal from me. He turned back to Scarlett, and for the first time she saw something different in those eyes. Not coldness, but an old, buried pain. But that's not the only reason. Victoria reminds me of someone else. Someone who destroyed my father's life. Scarlett stayed quiet and waited. Sebastian wasn't the type to share, and she knew this was a rare moment. My father was a small businessman, he said, his voice dropping lower. He wasn't a criminal, wasn't mafia, just a man trying to build a modest transport company to feed his family. Then a partner came along, promised to help him expand, and my father trusted him. A bitter smile touched Sebastian's mouth and vanished. That man took everything. The company, the money, the house, and when my father tried to get it back, that man killed him. I was 17 when I watched my father die in front of me and couldn't do a thing. Scarlett felt her heart tighten. She looked at Sebastian differently now. Not as a terrifying mafia boss, but as a 17-year-old boy who'd lost everything, the way she had. Sebastian turned to face her fully, his gray eyes settling back into their usual cold. I built everything you see so no one could ever hurt me again. Power is the only protection in this world, and Victoria Monroe is the same kind of person as the one who killed my father. A venomous snake wearing human skin. He stepped closer, looming over Scarlett, looking down at her. We share an enemy. That makes us useful to each other. Scarlett stood, meeting him at close range. I don't want to owe you. Sebastian gave a quiet laugh, a laugh with no warmth. You won't owe me. This is a business partnership. I provide protection and resources to investigate Victoria. You provide inside information about Harrison Group that only William Harrison's daughter would know. When Victoria falls, we both profit. Scarlett studied him for a long moment, weighing it all. Then she nodded. Fine. They shook hands, and Scarlett felt the strength in Sebastian's cold grip, the strength of a man who'd built an empire from the ashes of his family. She didn't know if this was the right decision or the wrong one, but she knew it was her only chance. At the same time, in the Harrison mansion on the Upper East Side, Victoria Monroe sat in her luxurious study, a glass of red wine in her hand, eyes fixed on her phone screen. A message had just arrived from her source in the police department. Scarlett Harrison is alive. She's with Sebastian Blackwood in Brooklyn. Victoria set the glass down, her face turning to ice. She dialed a familiar number, and when the person on the other end answered, her voice was as cold as winter wind. Find the girl, and this time, make sure she disappears for good. The real war had begun. 3 days after the alliance was formed, Scarlett left Harold Whitmore's office after a long afternoon buried in legal documents. They were building a case to prove Victoria's will was a forgery, page by page, signature by signature, seal by seal. It was meticulous work, slow work, but Scarlett knew it was the only path to reclaim what was hers in a way the law couldn't dismiss. She stepped out onto Manhattan streets at sunset, city lights beginning to flare as the sun slipped behind the towers of glass and steel. Crowds streamed along the sidewalks, horns blared, voices rose and fell, music spilled from storefronts, all of it blending into the familiar symphony of New York. 2 of Sebastian's bodyguards walked behind her at a careful distance, their eyes constantly sweeping the surroundings. Scarlett had grown used to their presence, though she still wasn't truly comfortable with being watched 24 hours a day. But Sebastian had made it clear, this was non-negotiable. Victoria had struck once, and she would strike again. Scarlett was nearing the corner to hail a cab when she heard the roar of a motorcycle engine behind her. Louder than normal, closer than normal. She turned just as one of the guards shouted, "Get down!" Everything happened in an instant. A black motorcycle tore toward them at a terrifying speed. The passenger wore a hoodie pulled low to hide his face, and his arm came up with a handgun. Scarlett saw the barrel aimed straight at her head, and in that moment time seemed to freeze. She couldn't react, couldn't move. She only stood there, locked in place like a deer caught in headlights. Then a figure lunged from nowhere and slammed into her, knocking her down onto the sidewalk. The gunshot cracked at the same moment she hit the ground, her shoulder striking concrete hard enough to jar her teeth. Scarlett lifted her head and saw Sebastian standing where she'd been, his left hand clamped over his right shoulder, dark red blood seeping through his fingers and spilling down his black suit. The motorcycle was already gone. Marcus was in pursuit with an SUV, chasing from a black car, but in Manhattan traffic the chance of catching them was nearly nothing. Sebastian staggered, and Scarlett scrambled up to catch him. There was more blood than she'd expected, soaking her hand, hot and slick. "Why?" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. "Why did you do that?" Sebastian looked at her, his face pale from pain and blood loss, but his gray eyes were as cold as ever. "Because a dead ally is useless." The other bodyguard had already called for a vehicle, and within seconds they were getting Sebastian into the car. Scarlett climbed in after him, not caring about the curious stares from pedestrians, not caring that the police could arrive at any moment. She only watched Sebastian's face as it grew whiter by the minute, and she pressed her hand over the wound on instinct, trying to slow the bleeding. They didn't go to a hospital. Instead, the car drove straight back to the headquarters in Brooklyn, where a middle-aged man with glasses was waiting with a full set of medical tools. A private doctor, Scarlett guessed. In Sebastian's world, everything could be handled without touching the official system. She was pushed out while the doctor worked, and she stood in the hallway with her back against the wall, staring down at her hands still smeared with Sebastian's blood. 2 hours later, the doctor came out, tired but relieved. The bullet went through the shoulder. No bone, no artery. He lost a lot of blood, but he'll be fine. He needs a few weeks of rest. Scarlett let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, as if a massive weight had been lifted from her chest. She went into the room and saw Sebastian lying on the bed, his face still pale, his shoulder wrapped in stark white bandages. He was unconscious from blood loss and pain medication. Marcus appeared behind her, voice low. "You can go rest. We'll watch him." Scarlett shook her head, her eyes fixed on Sebastian. "He took a bullet for me. I'm staying." She found a chair and sat beside the bed, watching the face of the man who'd saved her life. In sleep, Sebastian looked different. The hard lines of his face softened, the coldness fell away, and she could almost glimpse the young man he'd once been before this world had turned him into what he was now. She didn't know how long she sat there. She only knew that when she opened her eyes, her neck ached from sleeping, hunched in the chair, and the faint light of dawn had slipped through the gap in the curtains. She lifted her head and saw Sebastian's eyes open, those gray eyes fixed on her with a strange expression she'd never seen before. "You stayed all night." His voice was rough from dryness. Scarlett nodded, saying nothing. Sebastian watched her for a long moment, and then something strange happened. He smiled, not the razor-thin smile he usually wore, not the cold smile that came when he was calculating something. It was a real smile, small and fleeting, but enough to warm that severe face for a single moment. "Stubborn ally," he murmured, then closed his eyes again. Scarlett sat there with her heart beating out of rhythm, and she knew something between them had shifted forever. The days that followed moved slowly inside Sebastian's room. The doctor had ordered at least 2 weeks of rest, no movement of the right shoulder, and bandages changed twice a day. Marcus wanted to hire a professional nurse, but Scarlett refused before Sebastian could even speak. She said it was her responsibility, and she would handle it herself. Sebastian didn't argue. That morning, Scarlett sat on the edge of the bed and carefully peeled away the old bandage from Sebastian's shoulder. The wound was healing, but it was still red and swollen, the line of stitches stretching across his tanned skin like a reminder of that night. She tried to keep her hands from shaking as she dabbed antiseptic on it, but standing this close to him, feeling the heat of his body, catching the scent of soap and something else that was unmistakably his, made it harder to focus than usual. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly as she wrapped the fresh bandage. Sebastian looked at her, gray eyes bright in the morning light slipping through the curtains. "I've been stabbed 4 times and shot twice before. This is just a scratch." Scarlett paused, staring at him. "You say that like it's normal." "In my world, it is," Sebastian answered, his voice flat. She finished the bandage, but she didn't get up right away. She sat there, noticing other scars she hadn't seen before, a long one along his arm, a round mark near his ribs, the traces of a life built on violence. "How long have you lived like this?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment, as if weighing whether to answer. Then he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Since I was 17. Since the day my father died." He'd told her about his father before, but only in rough outlines. Now, maybe because of the pain, maybe because of exhaustion, or maybe for some reason he didn't understand himself, Sebastian began to tell her more. "My father's name was Thomas. He had a small transport company in New Jersey, 3 trucks, 5 employees. Not rich, but enough to live. He was a good man, too good for this world. He believed in fairness, believed that if you worked hard and treated people well, things would turn out all right." Sebastian stared out the window, eyes fixed on a distant past. Then Richard Callahan showed up, a big businessman who promised he'd invest in my father's company, help him expand all along the East Coast. My father trusted him, signed everything without reading closely, and within 6 months, Callahan took everything. The company, the trucks, even the house we lived in. Sebastian's voice turned colder. My father tried to fight back. He went to Callahan, threatened to go to the police, to expose everything, and that night, 2 men came to our house. They made me and my mother watch while they beat my father to death right there in the living room. Scarlett felt her heart tighten. She reached out and lightly touched his arm without thinking, a reflex of comfort. Sebastian looked down at her hand, but he didn't pull away. I stood there, 17 years old, and I couldn't do anything. After that, I swore it would never happen again. I built everything you see, telling myself it was for justice. But the truth? He stopped, his gaze meeting hers. The truth is, it was for control, so no one could ever hurt me again. Silence stretched between them. Then Sebastian added, his voice sounding like he was admitting something he'd never said out loud. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, things that keep me from sleeping at night. Scarlett looked at him. Then why do you keep going? Sebastian gave a faint smile, but without his usual bitterness. Because I don't know any other way. Not until recently. She didn't ask what he meant by recently, but she could guess. And that made her heartbeat quicken. I used to think my father was perfect, she said softly, as if sharing her own private secret. He was a billionaire. A man who built an empire from nothing. In my eyes, he could do anything, but now I know he was just a frightened man. Afraid of losing what he'd built. Afraid he couldn't protect me. Afraid to face the truth, and he chose silence instead of fighting. She looked at Sebastian. We're more alike than I thought. Sebastian shook his head slowly. No, you're different. You still have light in you. He lifted his hand, and Scarlett thought he was going to touch her face, but he stopped at her hand where it still rested on his arm. He laid his hand over hers, gentle and warm. Don't let this world take that light away. They sat there in silence, hand in hand, saying nothing more. But they both understood something had shifted between them, something that went beyond an alliance of shared benefit, beyond a shared enemy, beyond all the calculations and strategies. At last, Scarlett stood and pulled her hand back. I'll let you rest, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. She stepped out of the room, closed the door behind her, and leaned against the hallway wall. Her heart was beating out of rhythm. Her cheeks were hot, and she realized a truth that frightened her more than Victoria, more than hired killers, more than anything she'd faced since the night she'd been thrown out of the cemetery. She had begun to care about Sebastian Blackwood. And that could destroy everything. 1 week after the assassination attempt, when Sebastian could stand and move around again, even though his shoulder was still wrapped in bandages, Harold Whitmore called Scarlett with unexpected news. Derek Monroe wanted to see her. Scarlett nearly dropped the phone when she heard that name. Derek, Victoria's son, the one who'd helped drive her out of the house. The one who'd stood there and watched her get dragged into the rain without saying a word. What does he want? She asked, her voice cold as ice. I don't know, Harold answered carefully. He reached out to me this morning and said there's something important he needs to tell you. He seems different. Panicked. I'm not sure what's going on. But I think you should hear him out. Scarlett agreed to meet Derek at a small coffee shop in Lower Manhattan, public enough to feel safe, but quiet enough for them to talk. She arrived 15 minutes early, chose a corner table where she could watch the entrance, and waited. When Derek walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. The man she remembered had been arrogant, always dressed in designer labels, always carrying himself like the world owed him something. But the man in front of her now looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. Stubble covered his jaw. His clothes were wrinkled, his whole posture worn out, like someone who'd just crawled out of hell. Derek sat across from her, his hands trembling as he lifted the cup of coffee the server set down. Thanks for coming, he said, his voice hoarse. I know you've got no reason to trust me. Scarlett looked at him with a flat, icy stare. That's right, so speak fast. What do you want? Derek swallowed, staring down at the tabletop like he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. I found out what my mother did. To you, to William, to everything. You already know, Scarlett said coldly. So this isn't new. Derek shook his head, then finally looked up. And she saw something there she hadn't expected. Fear. No, you don't know everything. My mother killed William. Slowly. She poisoned him through his medication for months before he died. The doctors called it heart failure, but that's because the poison she used caused symptoms that looked exactly like heart disease. Scarlett felt as if she'd been punched in the chest. She'd suspected Victoria had a hand in her father's death, but hearing Derek confirm it still left her reeling. How do you know? Derek pulled a tiny USB drive from his pocket and set it on the table. I found this in my mother's private safe. Receipts for buying the poison from an illegal source. Messages with a doctor who'd lost his license about how to administer it. And a personal journal where she wrote everything down, every dose, every day. She's gone insane, Scarlett. She recorded murdering her husband like it was a business project. He slid the USB toward her, his hand still shaking. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I thought William died of illness. I thought you were thrown out because my mother wanted to protect the family's assets. I didn't know she was a killer. He stopped, his voice tightening as if his throat were closing. I can't live with this anymore. Scarlett looked at the USB, then at Derek. Part of her wanted to believe him, the part that still remembered the days she and Derek lived under the same roof. Not close, not warm, but not outright enemies either. The part that wanted to believe he truly regretted what he'd done. But another part of her, the part sharpened by weeks on the street and by working under Sebastian's shadow, warned her that it all felt too perfect, too neatly timed. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Derek drew a deep breath. "Next week, my mother's hosting a charity gala in the name of the Harrison Foundation at the Plaza Hotel. All of New York's upper class will be there. The press, politicians, everyone. It's the perfect chance for you to show up and expose her in front of them all." "And you'll get me inside?" Derek nodded. "I can bring you in through the service entrance. No one will suspect anything." That night, Scarlett told Sebastian about the meeting. He listened in silence, his face unreadable, but when she finished, his cold gray eyes fixed on her like a blade. "It's a trap," he said bluntly. Scarlett let out a slow breath. "I know it could be a trap." Sebastian's brow tightened. "You know and you still want to go?" She met his gaze. "But what if he's telling the truth? What if he really wants to make amends? Derek might be a bastard, but William treated him like a son. Maybe he actually feels guilty." Sebastian stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to her. "Everything is too convenient. Right when you need evidence, Derek shows up with a USB full of documents. Right when you need a way to get close to Victoria, he offers to bring you into the gala. You don't find that suspicious?" Scarlett rose and stepped beside him. "I do, but I also see that this might be my only chance. And if I don't take it, I might regret it for the rest of my life." They stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Scarlett said, "Derek wants to meet me again to talk details. Alone. No bodyguards." "Where?" "An abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn." Sebastian didn't speak. He only looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he nodded. "Fine. Go." Scarlett left 10 minutes later, alone, exactly as Derek had demanded. She didn't look back, but she knew Sebastian was standing at the window watching her go. She didn't hear him speak to Marcus. "Marcus, follow her. Keep your distance. Don't let her notice." The abandoned warehouse sat deep in Brooklyn's industrial district, far from streetlights and curious eyes. Scarlett stepped in through a half-open iron door, her footsteps echoing across cracked concrete. Inside it was almost pitch black, with only a few weak industrial bulbs dangling overhead, casting thin pools of light in the darkness. Derek stood in the middle of the warehouse, alone, tense, his eyes constantly flicking around as if he were waiting for something. When he saw Scarlett enter, he swallowed hard, his face even paler than the last time she'd seen him. "You came," Derek said, his voice shaking. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Scarlett stopped about 5 meters away, her gaze sweeping the space. "If I say I'll come, I come. Do you have anything new?" Derek looked at her, and in the blink of an eye she saw something pass through his expression. Guilt, cowardice, and betrayal. "I'm sorry, Scarlett," he said, his voice thick. "I'm really sorry." Before she could react, footsteps sounded from every direction. 5 men stepped out of the shadows, each holding a gun or a knife, closing around her from all sides. They weren't street thugs like the ones who'd come to Maggie's bakery. These men were professionals, eyes cold, movements precise, clearly hired killers who didn't come cheap. Derek edged back, unable to meet Scarlett's eyes. "My mother promised she'd give me everything if I brought you here. Company, shares, money, all of it. I didn't have a choice." Scarlett stood there, surrounded by 5 assassins, and she did something that made everyone freeze. She smiled. "I knew you'd betray me, Derek." Derek frowned, confusion spreading across his face. "What are you talking about?" Scarlett tilted her head, her eyes razor sharp. "Did you really think I'd come here alone?" The sound of guns being cocked rang out from every direction. Not from the men surrounding her, but from the darkness around them. More than a dozen men stepped into view, weapon-mounted flashlights blasting straight into the assassins' faces, blinding them and throwing them off balance. In the center of them, Sebastian Blackwood emerged from the shadows, his black suit perfect as always, his gray eyes cold as ice, a handgun in his grip aimed at the head of the man standing closest to Scarlett. "Drop your weapons," Sebastian said, his voice empty of emotion. Right now, Derek's assassins were professionals, but they weren't stupid. They knew they were outnumbered and outpositioned. Within seconds, guns and knives hit the floor, and Sebastian's men had all of them cuffed. Derek stood there with his eyes wide in horror, unable to believe what he was seeing. "No," he stammered. "You couldn't have known." Scarlett walked up to him until there was only a single step between them. "Do you think I'm still the naive girl who got thrown out of the cemetery in the rain? I changed, Derek. This world taught me how to play the game." She glanced at Sebastian, then back at Derek. Sebastian and I planned this the moment you contacted Harold. We knew you'd betray me. We needed you to betray me. Because it was the only way to get direct proof that Victoria ordered my murder." Derek's face drained. "What proof?" One of the assassins stepped forward, and Scarlett recognized him as one of Sebastian's men, planted from the start. He pulled a small voice recorder from his pocket. Every call between him and Victoria over the past week, every directive text, everything recorded. Sebastian stepped in, took Derek's phone from his pocket, and scrolled through the messages. "Your mother is very detailed when she gives orders," he said, his tone edged with mockery. "She even sent the address of this warehouse and specific instructions for how to handle Miss Scarlett once you caught her." Scarlett looked at Derek, and the anger in her eyes was gone, replaced by grief and disappointment. "You had a choice, Derek. You always had a choice. And you chose your mother," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's my mother, and William was your stepfather," Scarlett replied, her calm more frightening than anger. "He treated you like a son. He gave you everything. He loved you. He trusted you. And this is how you repay him?" Derek fell silent, head bowed, nothing left to say. The excuses, the reasons, all of it became meaningless in the face of the naked truth that he'd chosen to stand with a murderer instead of justice. Sebastian signaled his men, "Take him. Keep him somewhere safe until this is over. Don't hurt him." When Derek was led away, Sebastian turned to Scarlett and handed her Derek's phone. "We have everything we need now. Messages, recordings, a witness. Victoria has nowhere left to run." Scarlett took the phone and looked down at the screen, at Victoria's deadly instructions staring back at her. Then she lifted her head, her eyes bright with a resolve she'd never had before. "It's time to end this." The Plaza Hotel that night blazed with the kind of splendor that belonged in a fairy tale, bright as a palace built for legends. Crystal chandeliers poured warm, golden light into the vast grand hall, where hundreds of guests in elegant evening wear talked in polished circles, lifting glasses of champagne and trading handshakes that carried calculations beneath their smiles. This was the annual charity gala of the Harrison Foundation, the most important social event of the fall, the place where New York's elite gathered to display their wealth under the clean, respectable mask of generosity. The press lined both sides of the red carpet, cameras flashing without pause. Politicians, business leaders, entertainment stars, all of them were there. All of them eager to be seen near Victoria Monroe, the woman now running one of the largest real estate empires in the United States. Victoria stood on the stage, breathtaking, in a deep crimson gown, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist. She was speaking about the future of Harrison Group, about new philanthropic projects, about how she would continue the legacy of her late husband, William Harrison. Her voice was sweet and persuasive, and the room listened as if a saint were offering blessings. None of them knew the woman on the stage was a murderer. None of them knew she'd poisoned her husband day by day, driven his daughter out into the street, forged a will to steal an empire, and ordered that same daughter killed when she learned the girl was still alive. None of them knew. Not until now. The great doors of the grand hall flew open. The sound turned a few heads, then more, then the entire room. Victoria stopped mid-sentence and frowned toward the entrance, and she saw her. Scarlett Harrison stepped into the hall alone, wearing a floor-length black gown, dark hair spilling over her shoulders, chin lifted, stride steady. She wasn't the drenched girl dragged from a cemetery in the rain anymore. She wasn't the homeless woman sleeping on a subway station bench. She was Scarlett Harrison, the rightful heir to Harrison Group, and she'd come back to take what was hers. The hall went dead silent. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then whispers began to spread like ripples across water. "Was that Scarlett Harrison? That can't be. She's dead. I read about the suicide." Victoria's face blanched for an instant, but she was an excellent actress. In seconds she recovered, letting a smile bloom, soft with manufactured pity. "Security," she called, her voice full of authority. "This woman is an imposter. Remove her at once." 2 security guards moved toward Scarlett, but Scarlett didn't stop. She kept walking toward the stage, and there was something in her eyes, in the way she carried herself, that made the guards hesitate. They looked at each other, uncertain. Scarlett climbed the steps to the stage and faced Victoria from only a few feet away. When she spoke, her voice carried through the microphone that was still live, filling the entire grand hall. "I'm Scarlett Harrison, William Harrison's daughter, and I'm still alive." A wave of noise burst across the room. Victoria gave a thin laugh, but Scarlett could see her hands were shaking. "This is a sick joke," Victoria announced, turning to the crowd. My husband's daughter took her own life out of grief. There's a death certificate. There's a police report. This woman is a con artist trying to steal an inheritance." Scarlett tipped her head, eyes cold as steel. "Is that so? Or is that only what you wanted everyone to believe?" She lifted her hand and gestured toward the back of the hall, where Nathan Cross, a well-known investigative reporter from the New York Times, stood beside a technician at a projector. The lights dimmed, and the massive screen behind the stage flared to life. First came two wills displayed side by side. One was William Harrison's true will, with a signature verified by an expert, stating clearly that Scarlett would inherit 70% of the assets. The other was the forged will Victoria had submitted to the court, the signature faked. Then William Harrison's video played, his face filling the giant screen, his voice echoing through the grand hall as he explained how Victoria had deceived him. And finally came the recorded calls between Victoria and Derek, her voice cold and precise as she ordered Scarlett found and killed, followed by text messages outlining the assassination plan in detail. The room froze. Victoria stood there as her face shifted from pallor to a furious flush, her eyes sweeping the crowd like an animal trapped with nowhere left to run. Then she ran. She leapt down from the stage, shoving through people, lunging toward an emergency exit. But the moment the door flew open, two FBI agents in black suits were waiting, handcuffs shining under the lights. Harold had contacted them 2 days earlier and provided full evidence of murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit assassination. Victoria spun back, her eyes wild, and she screamed up at Scarlett, her voice drenched in hate. "You think you've won. You're nothing, nothing at all." Scarlett stood on the stage, looking down at the woman who'd tried to destroy her life, and she didn't scream back. She didn't need to. Her voice was calm and clear when it rose into the stunned silence of the hall. "I'm my father's daughter, and at last, I've come home." The FBI agents cuffed Victoria and led her away, her shrieks echoing and fading as the doors closed. The grand hall remained silent for a long moment, no one knowing how to respond to what they'd just witnessed. Then one clap rang out, then another. Then the entire room erupted into thunderous applause, cheers, voices calling her name. Scarlett Harrison had returned from the dead, and she'd won. The days after the gala night became the biggest media storm New York had witnessed in decades. Every newspaper, every news channel, every social media feed was flooded with images of Victoria Monroe being led away in handcuffs, of Scarlett Harrison standing on the stage with an unbreakable stare, of the shocking evidence unveiled in front of hundreds of witnesses from the city's upper crust. But that was only the beginning. The FBI launched a sweeping investigation into Victoria Monroe, and what they uncovered was more horrific than anything Scarlett had ever imagined. Harold called her on the morning of the third day after the arrest, his voice trembling in a way she'd never heard before. "You need to come to my office right away. There's something you have to know." Scarlett went to Harold's office with Sebastian, who hadn't let her out of his sight since the gala. Harold sat behind his desk, looking as if he'd aged 10 years in a matter of days, a thick stack of documents spread out in front of him. "The FBI just sent me the preliminary findings," Harold said, his voice heavy. "Victoria killed William." Scarlett nodded, forcing herself to stay steady. "I know. Derek gave me a USB with proof of the poisoning." Harold shook his head. "No, you don't know all of it. The FBI exhumed William's body for a second autopsy. They found traces of a rare poison in his bones and organs, a toxin that mimics heart disease when it's administered slowly over a long period of time. Victoria poisoned him for the last 6 months of his life, day after day, dose by dose. "She killed my father," Scarlett whispered, her voice shaking no matter how hard she tried to control it. "She really killed my father." Harold looked at her with eyes full of pain. "William suspected it. That's why he prepared everything. Hid the real will inside the necklace, recorded the video. He knew he was dying, and he knew it wasn't natural, but he had no proof, and he was afraid that if he acted, Victoria would hurt you first." Scarlett clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms until she nearly drew blood. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage, of pure hatred for the woman who'd stolen her father in the most brutal way possible. But that still wasn't the worst of it, Harold continued, his voice sounding like he was describing a nightmare. "The FBI investigated Victoria's past. She was married once before she met William, to a businessman named Richard Monroe, Derek's biological father. Richard Monroe died 15 years ago, of heart failure." Scarlett lifted her head, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. "You're saying—" Harold nodded, his face gone ashen. "The FBI exhumed Richard Monroe's body. They found the same poison, the same method, the same pattern. Victoria killed her first husband the exact same way 15 years ago, to inherit his assets. That's how she had enough money to get close to William, to become the society woman he met. She's a serial killer, Scarlett. She turned marriage into a weapon. The room sank into heavy silence. Scarlett sat there without words, trying to absorb the truth that the woman who'd lived under the same roof as her for 5 years was a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered 2 husbands for money. Sebastian placed a hand on Scarlett's shoulder and gave a small squeeze, saying nothing, but his presence was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Victoria Monroe's trial lasted 3 months and became the most watched case in the history of New York's legal system. She was charged with 17 counts, 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, forging a will, fraud, embezzlement, perjury, and a long list of other crimes. Her attorneys tried to defend her, tried to blame mental illness, but the evidence was too clear, and the journals documenting each dose of poison were too meticulous to deny. The jury needed only 4 hours to return a verdict, guilty on every charge. Victoria Monroe was sentenced to life without parole. Derek was charged as an accomplice in the plot to assassinate Scarlett, but because he cooperated with investigators and provided crucial evidence, the court gave him a 5-year suspended sentence. He left the courtroom with empty eyes, a man who'd lost his mother, his honor, everything. Scarlett didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to watch Victoria being taken away. She had her justice. The court affirmed Scarlett Harrison as William Harrison's only legal heir, with 70% of Harrison Group's shares and all of his personal assets. After months of living like a homeless woman, declared dead, hunted like an animal, she finally had everything back. The night after the sentencing, Scarlett stood on the balcony of Sebastian's penthouse, looking out over New York City glittering below. The same city that had watched her get thrown out of Woodlawn Cemetery in the rain, sleep in a subway station, almost starve on the streets. And now she was standing here, looking down at it from above. Sebastian stepped onto the balcony and stood beside her. He didn't speak, only stood there, his shoulder nearly touching hers, his presence warm and steady. "You did it," he said after a long while. Scarlett turned to him, her eyes shining in the city light. "We did it. I couldn't have done this alone." Sebastian looked at her, gray eyes deep, and he didn't say anything else. He only reached out, took her hand, gentle and warm. They stood there in silence, hand in hand, watching the city breathe beneath them. And for the first time in months, since that stormy day at Woodlawn Cemetery, Scarlett Harrison felt peace. 1 year later, Scarlett returned to Woodlawn Cemetery on a beautiful autumn morning. The sky was a clear, endless blue without a single cloud, and warm golden sunlight poured over rows of trees, turning a fierce red-orange. It was nothing like the last time she'd stood here, in driving rain, dragged away like a criminal from her own father's funeral. She knelt in front of William Harrison's headstone and laid a fresh bouquet of white roses on the spotless granite. Her fingers drifted lightly over the carved letters of her father's name, and she smiled, the first smile she'd managed in this place since the day he died. "I found my way back, Dad, just like you believed I would." The past year had been a year of enormous change. Scarlett had officially taken over Harrison Group as chair of the board and chief executive officer, becoming one of the youngest women to lead a billion-dollar real estate empire in America. But she didn't rush to expand or chase explosive growth the way so many people expected. Instead, she focused on strengthening the foundation, honoring what her father had built, and making sure every Harrison Group project created real value for the community. She also founded the Harrison Foundation, a charitable organization focused on 3 areas she understood more deeply than anyone: supporting women experiencing domestic violence, caring for orphans, and helping people without homes reintegrate into society. The foundation's launch was held at the same Plaza Hotel where she'd faced Victoria 1 year earlier, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no tension, no confrontation, only joy and hope. And among the invited guests, there was one woman Scarlett personally went to greet, Maggie Chen, the woman who'd handed her a bowl of hot porridge when she collapsed at the bakery door, stood in the glittering hall in a new dress Scarlett had chosen for her, eyes shining with tears. Maggie's bakery had been rebuilt, bigger and more beautiful than ever, with a bright new sign and small words in the corner, sponsored by the Harrison Foundation. "You didn't have to do this," Maggie said, her voice breaking. Scarlett held her hand and smiled. "You saved my life, when I had nothing." I'll never forget that. Derek Monroe was there too, standing off to one side, quiet and closed in on himself. After completing his suspended sentence, he'd secured a small position at Harrison Group, an ordinary office job with ordinary pay. No privileges, no special treatment. Scarlett had agreed, Not because she'd forgiven him, but because she believed everyone deserved a second chance if they truly wanted to change. When Derek approached her after the ceremony, head bowed as he thanked her, she said only one sentence. "What you do with this chance is up to you. Don't waste it." Victoria Monroe was serving a life sentence in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. Scarlett didn't attend the sentencing, didn't follow the news about her, didn't care about the letters Victoria sent from behind bars asking to see her. When people asked why, Scarlett answered simply, "She no longer deserves my time." Scarlett rose from her father's grave and brushed the dust from the knees of her skirt. She turned and saw Sebastian standing a few steps away, waiting, patient, as always. He'd changed a great deal in the past year. No longer the cold mafia boss she'd first met in Maggie's bakery, Sebastian was slowly withdrawing from the underworld, converting illegal operations into legitimate companies, cutting off toxic ties, building a new empire that was cleaner, more respectable. The process wasn't easy and would take years, but he was moving in the right direction. Scarlett walked to him, and together they looked down at William Harrison's grave. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Leaving that world, Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to her, and his gray eyes were warmer than she'd ever seen. "I'm not leaving anything behind. I'm choosing what's worth more." They stood there a little longer, shoulder to shoulder, in the peaceful hush of the cemetery. Then Sebastian held out his hand, and Scarlett took it, their fingers weaving together naturally as if they'd done it 1,000 times. On the desk in the chairman's office at Harrison Group, Scarlett's necklace now rested in a small glass case, displayed like a treasured keepsake. It no longer needed to be hidden. It no longer needed to guard any secret, but it would always be a reminder of the road she'd walked, of a father who loved her to his last breath, and of the strength she found inside herself when everything was taken away. Scarlett and Sebastian left the cemetery hand in hand, walking beneath the honey-gold autumn sun. Before she reached the gates, she looked back at her father's grave one last time and whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for believing in me." Scarlett Harrison didn't rise because she was the daughter of a billionaire. She rose because she endured loss without losing herself. And in a world that tried to erase her existence, she chose something rarer than revenge. She chose to become someone worth remembering. Scarlett's story teaches us that a person's true worth doesn't live in what others can take away, whether it's money, status, or even identity itself. That worth lives in how we stand up after we fall, in how we treat others when we hold power, and in the choices we make when no one is watching. Sometimes life will strip away everything we have, but it can never steal who we are, unless we let it. Thank you for following this story from beginning to end. If Scarlett's story touched your heart, please share it with the people you love, the ones who might need to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more moving stories each day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever lived through a moment when life took everything, yet you still stood back up? How can you connect Scarlett's story to your own real life? Share with us in the comments below. We read every comment and we always want to hear what you're feeling from deep in your heart, because those shared words are the fuel that helps us keep bringing you stories with more meaning. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Remember that no matter how hard life gets, you still have the strength to get through it, just like Scarlett did. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.